The file begins. February 2025. The 24th Annual AARP's Movies for Grown-Ups Awards. A temple of tasteful self-congratulation. Pause. Liev Schreiber is on stage, a monolith of quiet confidence presenting an award. But the teleprompter begins to swim. A jagged, shimmering line fractures his vision like a crack in reality. The lights are no longer a warm glow. They are a physical assault. 1,000 suns burning just for him. He grips the lectern, the polished wood suddenly feeling like cold, rough concrete. This is not stage fright. This is an inventory of system failure. The audience, accustomed to actors and their dramatic pauses, leans in. His team, just off stage, sees the pallor of his skin, the slight tremor in his hand. They see the first signs of a crisis that no script could ever prepare for. The applause for the nominee sounds distant, like handfuls of dirt thrown on a coffin lid. A fatal error has been triggered in the code of his life. And this is just the overture to a much darker symphony. The aftermath is a sterile silence. The green room, moments before a nexus of agents and publicists, is now a makeshift infirmary smelling of fear and bottled water. The official narrative is dehydration, a minor inconvenience. But here, behind the closed door, the real audit begins. This was not a simple migraine. It was a hostile takeover of his own neurology. The doctors offer empty phrases. Atypical aura. Stress-induced phenomenon. They are mechanics staring at an engine they cannot comprehend. This is the true anatomy of loneliness. To be surrounded by people yet utterly alone, with the curse blooming inside your own skull. His fate, once a solid trajectory of prestige and success, now feels fractured, broken. The terror is not in the pain itself, but in its randomness. The insanity of not knowing when the switch will flip again, plunging him back into that blinding, silent chaos. He now lives with a ghost in his own machine, a ghost that threatens to seize control at any moment. But every ghost has an origin story, a point of infection. To perform this post-mortal audit, we must rewind the tape past the gloss of prestige, back to the glitter and misery of a New York City that no longer exists. His childhood was not a story of hardship. It was an apprenticeship in the anatomy of the city's soul. His mother, a bohemian artist behind the wheel of a yellow cab, taught him the city's grid. His father, an actor, a distant blueprint of a life on stage. He was raised on a diet of artistic ambition and cold water flats on the Lower East Side. Pause. This was not poverty. It was a masterclass in observing the cracks in the facade. His inheritance was not wealth, but a profound understanding of the desperation that fuels genius. The intensity seen on screen was not a choice learned at Yale. It was a survival mechanism forged in the concrete crucible, a spiritual armor against the indifference of the metropolis. This armor of steel and shadow was supposed to be his fortress, a bulwark against the world. Yet it was the very profession he chose, the stage itself, that began to betray him. A twisted fate. The classical training, the deep dives into the abyss of character, was not just an act. It was a systematic dismantling of the self. For years, he invited other ghosts to live in his skull. Hamlet, Iago, Macbeth. Pause. He lent them his voice, his gait, his neurology. The rookie's error was assuming they would all leave quietly when the curtain fell. They did not. They left traces. Scars on his psychic architecture. The will, once a tool for creation, was now locked in a civil war. The strange electrical storms in his brain were not a random medical anomaly. They were the echoes of past performances. The price of inhabiting too many broken men. A bill for services rendered finally coming due. The first invoice arrived not in an envelope, but as a series of hushed phone calls from the production's insurance underwriters. The set of the Apple TV Plus thriller, a project meant to be a comfortable late-career victory lap, became a quiet courtroom. His scene partners noticed it first, a slight tremor in his hand, a line of dialogue lost in the middle distance. Trivialities, unless you have $150 million riding on the man's neurological stability. The studio lawyers did not scream. They spoke in the calm, chilling tones of men who calculate risk in 9-figure increments. They invoked Clause 27B, the medical fitness guarantee, a standard piece of contractual boilerplate that suddenly became the anatomy of his professional execution. His agents argued. They called it exhaustion. They called it the method. But the real evidence was on a hard drive in a Pittsburgh neurologist's office, a preliminary EEG that looked less like a human brainwave and more like a seismograph during a tremor. Pause. The crash was not a public spectacle. It was a quiet, antiseptic foreclosure on his career, conducted via encrypted email and sealed with the threat of financial ruin. The loneliness of the diagnosis was absolute. A fortress of silence built around 2 words on a medical report he kept folded in his wallet like a death sentence. He walked red carpets, smiled for the cameras at award ceremonies, and spoke of future projects with directors like Aronofsky. A masterful performance, all while carrying the secret knowledge that his own mind was becoming an unreliable narrator. This was the true, inoperable curse. The secret evidence was not in a courtroom, but in the testimony of his own body. A deposition given in the form of migraines that felt like grinding glass. In the quiet fear of his wife, Pause Taylor, who learned to recognize the vacant stare that preceded an episode. Even his ex-partner, Pause Naomi, saw it from a distance. A shadow in the father of her children she had never seen before. The off-Broadway play with Pause Jackman was not a reunion. It was a desperate gamble, a final stress test on a failing component, hoping the familiar pressure of the stage would somehow recalibrate the broken machinery. It was a prayer whispered into the void of a sold-out theater. A man famous for playing men in control, losing control of the only thing that was ever truly his own consciousness. His own consciousness, a territory now occupied by a foreign power. The first tremors of this hostile takeover were felt not in a doctor's office, but on the Pittsburgh set of the Kepler series. Whispers about missed cues, a long pause where a line should be, small, almost imperceptible fissures in the concrete facade of his professionalism. The glitter of the Apple TV Plus deal began to flake away, revealing the cold misery underneath. The producers, men who had toasted his name with expensive whiskey, now spoke in the coded language of insurance adjusters. Their concern was not for the man. It was for the asset. The formal notice was not a lawsuit, but something colder. A breach of contract letter citing Section 4, Clause B, inability to perform. The document was an inventory of his sins, a quiet digital execution. The studio's completion bond was for Pause $120 million, a number that now functioned as the price of his own head. This was the true poverty of fame. To be surrounded by a crew of hundreds, yet to have no one to confide in that the architecture of your own mind was collapsing. The friendship was a fiction. The contract, however, was brutally real. The contract was brutally real. It demanded a pound of flesh he wasn't sure he still possessed. This was the crisis point. The anatomy of the fall laid bare. The fatal error would be to surrender, to accept the diagnosis of the lawyers and the whispers on set as a final verdict and retreat into the shadow of the bunker. The temptation was immense. A quiet life, the noise of the industry replaced by the sound of his children's laughter. A dignified exile. But the will is a strange primal muscle. It found its anchor not in the ghost of past glory, but in the face of his daughter, Hazel B. A legacy is not what you accumulate. It is what you refuse to let die. The craft became his weapon against the affliction. Line memorization was no longer for art, it was cognitive warfare. The actor's mask, once a tool for character, was now a shield to hide the man's terror. The breaking point arrived during a scene with Zazie Beetz. The words vanished. The world dissolved into a smear of light and sound. He held her gaze, channeling the raw panic into the eyes of his character. It became the most authentic moment of the entire production. A confession disguised as a performance. He survived the scene. He survived the day. This was not a victory. It was a stay of execution, purchased with the last reserves of a will that refused to be extinguished. The applause on set felt like handfuls of dirt thrown on a coffin lid, a hollow percussion for a death only he could feel. He drove home not through Pittsburgh, but through the ruins of his own certainty. The praise from the director, the awe from his co-stars. It was all anesthetic that was beginning to wear off. The real diagnosis was not delivered in a sterile office. It was delivered in the silence between his own heartbeats. He stood on the red carpet for the AARP Awards, a ghost in a tuxedo. The flashbulbs were interrogations. Every question about the future, about a new film with Aronofsky, felt like a mockery. Caught stealing. The irony was a blade twisting in his gut. His own biology was the thief, looting the archives of his mind. The loneliness was absolute. It was the loneliness of a man who could be in a room with his wife, Taylor, and his children, Sasha, and Kai, and still be stranded on a desolate moon of fear. This was the anatomy of the fall. Not a public spectacle, a quiet, internal demolition. The poverty was not of the wallet, but of the spirit. The curse had a name now, a clinical, multi-syllable word that landed with the soft thud of a prison door closing for the last time. The final verdict changes the nature of the war. It is no longer a battle for victory, but a negotiation for the terms of surrender. This is the posthumous audit of a man still living. The broken destiny was not the end of the road. It was a forced detour onto a path paved with brutal honesty. His will, that primal muscle, was repurposed. The work with United 24 was no longer charity. It became a frantic race to build a legacy of meaning before the internal thief could steal the architect himself. Every dollar raised for medical aid in Ukraine was a sandbag against the encroaching tide. The off-Broadway play, Creditors, became his confessional. A final payment on a debt to the craft that had both made and nearly unmade him. The crash was silent. The empire of the mind did not burn. Its lights were simply turned off one by one. But the man remained. His fate was not to be the titan of the screen he was supposed to be. It was to be a father, a husband, a man who, staring into the abyss, used his remaining light not for himself, but to illuminate the suffering of others. The curse took his future. In exchange, it gave him his soul.